Case 1. Pastor John Kinyua Murango. The Toyota Hilux sat abandoned on the dusty highway between Nairobi and Moyale, its doors hanging open like broken wings against the scorching Kenyan sun. Inside, Pastor John Kinyua Murango's phone buzzed endlessly with unanswered calls from his frantic family, the screen displaying dozens of missed messages that would never be returned. 3 days earlier, Murango had kissed his wife goodbye and climbed into that same vehicle, his heart heavy with both purpose and fear. The Seventh-day Adventist missionary was heading to one of Kenya's most dangerous regions to spread the gospel among communities that had never heard his message. It was the kind of mission that had defined his ministry for over 2 decades, bringing hope to the hopeless, light to the darkest corners of human existence. But this mission felt different. In the weeks leading up to his departure, Murango had confided to close friends that he'd been receiving death threats. Anonymous voices warned him to stay away from certain territories, to abandon his evangelical plans or face deadly consequences. The threats were specific enough to be credible, detailed enough to be terrifying. Yet Pastor Murango pressed forward, driven by an unshakable conviction that God's calling superseded human fear. His final text message to his family was both heartbreaking and prophetic. "Pray for me. If something happens, know that I died serving Christ." That message was sent at 3:47 p.m. on April 15, 2025. It was the last communication anyone would ever receive from Pastor John Kinyua Murango. When search teams reached his abandoned vehicle, they found his personal belongings untouched, his Bible open to Psalm 23, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." But Murango himself had vanished without a trace, as if the earth had simply swallowed him whole. This is the first of 10 chilling cases we'll explore today. Stories of religious leaders who disappeared into thin air, leaving behind only questions, grief, and the haunting reality that sometimes those who preach about eternal life simply vanish from this one. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we uncover the most disturbing mysteries involving those who claim divine authority. If you're captivated by true crime documentaries that explore the darkest corners of human behavior and unsolved mysteries, hit that subscribe button now. What you just witnessed with Pastor Murango is only the beginning of our journey into the unknown. These aren't just missing person cases. They're windows into a world where spiritual authority offers no protection from earthly dangers, where those who preach about divine protection find themselves utterly vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Case 2. Reverend William Reyes. In the volatile border regions of Colombia, where drug cartels and guerrilla groups wage endless wars for territory and power, preaching the gospel isn't just a calling, it's a death sentence waiting to be carried out. Reverend William Reyes knew this reality better than most, yet he continued his evangelical work in Mayacao, La Guajira, one of the most dangerous regions in South America. Reyes had built his ministry among Colombia's most marginalized communities, bringing hope to areas where government authority barely existed and violence was a daily reality. His church served as a sanctuary in a land where sanctuaries were rare, offering spiritual guidance to people caught between competing armed factions who showed no mercy to civilians. The evangelical pastor understood the risks of his calling. Colombia's religious leaders had been systematically targeted for decades by various armed groups who viewed Christianity as a threat to their control over local populations. Pastors were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered with horrifying regularity, their churches burned and their congregations scattered by fear. But Reyes refused to abandon his flock. He believed that Christ's message was more powerful than the bullets and intimidation tactics of armed criminals, and his unwavering faith had sustained his ministry through years of escalating violence in the region. On September 25, 2008, Reyes attended what would be his final ministers' meeting in the regional capital. The gathering brought together evangelical leaders from across La Guajira to discuss security concerns and coordinate their response to increasing threats against Christian workers. The irony would later prove devastating. A meeting about protecting pastors became the last place Reyes was seen alive. As evening fell, Reyes began his journey home through the treacherous mountain roads that connected remote evangelical communities. These routes were notorious hunting grounds for guerrilla groups who regularly ambushed travelers for ransom money or simply to eliminate perceived enemies. Somewhere along that dark highway, between the meeting location and his home church, Reverend William Reyes vanished completely. His vehicle was never found. No ransom demands were ever made, and no credible witnesses ever came forward with information about his fate. Colombian authorities suspected immediate involvement by guerrilla groups known to operate in the region. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, and other paramilitary organizations had a documented history of targeting religious leaders, viewing them as obstacles to their territorial control and ideological influence. International Christian persecution organizations launched investigations and diplomatic pressure campaigns, but the Colombian government's limited authority in remote regions made meaningful search efforts nearly impossible. The same lawlessness that made Reyes' ministry necessary also made his disappearance unsolvable. Years have passed since that September evening, yet Reverend William Reyes remains among the disappeared, one of hundreds of Colombian religious leaders who have been swallowed by the violence that continues to plague their nation. His case represents the deadly reality faced by those who dare to preach hope in places where hope itself has become a revolutionary act. Case 3. Pastor Kalibala Samuel. In the rural districts of Mityana Municipality, Uganda, Pastor Kalibala Samuel had built something remarkable, a congregation so devoted to his teachings that they hung on his every word and followed his guidance without question. His small church operated more like an extended family than a traditional religious institution, with members sharing resources, living in close proximity, and viewing Samuel as their spiritual father and earthly guide. Samuel's ministry attracted followers who were seeking deeper spiritual meaning beyond the conventional Christianity practiced in Uganda's mainstream churches. His teachings emphasized complete surrender to God's will and total trust in divine providence, messages that resonated powerfully with people struggling against poverty and uncertainty in rural Uganda. The pastor's influence over his congregation was absolute. Members frequently moved closer to the church compound, some abandoning their families and previous lives to dedicate themselves entirely to Samuel's vision of Christian living. This level of devotion would have raised red flags in other contexts, but in Uganda's religious landscape, charismatic leaders with devoted followings were not uncommon. What made Samuel's congregation unique was their willingness to follow him anywhere. When he spoke about divine revelations or God's calling to specific actions, his followers responded with immediate obedience that bordered on the supernatural. This blind faith would ultimately lead to one of Uganda's most baffling missing person cases. In early 2021, Pastor Samuel announced to his congregation that God had revealed a special mission that would require sacrifice and absolute trust. The details of this divine revelation remain vague, but Samuel's followers prepared themselves for whatever their spiritual leader might demand of them. On the day that would become known as the Great Disappearance, approximately 20 followers gathered with Pastor Samuel for what they believed would be a transformative spiritual experience. Neighbors later reported seeing the group leaving together in the early morning hours, carrying minimal possessions and appearing to be in high spirits about their mysterious journey. But they never returned. The mass disappearance triggered immediate alarm among family members who had not been part of Samuel's inner circle. Wives searched for missing husbands, children looked for vanished parents, and the broader community struggled to understand how an entire congregation could simply vanish without leaving any trace. Ugandan authorities launched one of the most extensive manhunts in the region's history, deploying search teams across multiple districts and following every possible lead. Helicopters scoured remote areas. Ground teams investigated caves and abandoned buildings, and investigators interviewed hundreds of witnesses who might have seen the missing group. The search yielded nothing. No bodies, no abandoned vehicles, no credible sightings, no evidence of foul play, just the haunting silence of 20-plus people who had walked out of their lives and into oblivion. Theories about their fate ranged from mass suicide to relocation to a remote compound, but none could be substantiated with evidence. Some investigators suspected that Samuel had led his followers into a deadly ritual based on apocalyptic beliefs, while others believed the group had simply moved to an isolated location to await the end times. The case remains one of Uganda's most disturbing unsolved mysteries, a reminder that religious devotion can sometimes lead believers into darkness from which they never return. Case 4. Pastor Raymond Koh. Pastor Raymond Koh was driving through the bustling streets of Petaling Jaya, Malaysia on February 13, 2017, when his ordinary Monday afternoon became the subject of one of the most documented kidnappings in Southeast Asian history. What makes Koh's disappearance particularly chilling isn't just that he vanished in broad daylight. It's that the entire abduction was captured on CCTV footage that reveals a level of coordination and planning that suggests government involvement. Koh had spent decades building bridges between Malaysia's diverse religious communities, operating the Harapan Community Center that provided aid to refugees and marginalized families regardless of their faith. His Christian ministry focused on practical love rather than aggressive evangelism, earning him respect, even among Malaysia's Muslim-majority population. But in Malaysia's increasingly polarized religious climate, even Koh's gentle approach to ministry had made him enemies. Islamic extremists viewed any Christian outreach as a threat to Malaysia's Muslim identity, while government officials grew suspicious of his refugee assistance work and its potential political implications. The pastor had received warnings from concerned friends about increasing surveillance and veiled threats, but nothing could have prepared him for what unfolded on that February afternoon. As Koh drove along a busy commercial street, multiple vehicles suddenly surrounded his car in a choreographed maneuver that suggested extensive planning and rehearsal. Security cameras captured the terrifying precision of the operation. Black SUVs blocked Koh's escape routes, while masked men emerged from multiple vehicles simultaneously. The abduction took less than 60 seconds, from start to finish, executed with military-style efficiency that left no room for resistance or escape. What shocked investigators most was the brazen nature of the kidnapping. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a random act of violence. It was a sophisticated operation carried out in broad daylight on a heavily trafficked street, suggesting the perpetrators felt confident they would face no consequences for their actions. The CCTV footage became crucial evidence in the investigation, but it also raised disturbing questions about who possessed the resources and training necessary to execute such a complex abduction. The level of coordination suggested involvement by professional operatives rather than common criminals or religious extremists. Malaysian authorities launched an investigation, but their efforts were hampered by what appeared to be deliberate obstacles and bureaucratic interference. Key evidence went missing, witnesses were intimidated into silence, and government officials seemed more interested in controlling the narrative than finding the truth about Koh's disappearance. International human rights organizations immediately suspected government involvement, pointing to Malaysia's history of targeting religious minorities and the sophisticated nature of the abduction operation. The Malaysian government's defensive responses and failure to produce meaningful results only deepened these suspicions. Koh's family and supporters organized vigils and launched social media campaigns demanding answers, but their efforts were met with harassment and threats that suggested powerful forces wanted the case to disappear. The pastor's wife and children lived in constant fear, never knowing if they might be next targets in what appeared to be a systematic campaign against Christian leaders. Years have passed since that February afternoon, yet Pastor Raymond Koh remains missing without any credible explanation from Malaysian authorities. His case has become a symbol of religious persecution and government impunity in Southeast Asia, demonstrating how easily inconvenient voices can be silenced when those in power decide they pose a threat. Case 5. Aimee Semple, Miss McPherson. In the glittering landscape of 1920s Los Angeles, where Hollywood dreams collided with religious revival, no figure was more magnetic than Aimee Semple McPherson. Known simply as Sister Aimee to her millions of followers, she had built the Angelus Temple into a religious empire that rivaled the movie studios for sheer spectacle and star power. Her theatrical sermons, complete with elaborate costumes and dramatic staging, drew crowds of 5,000 people who came to witness what many considered the greatest show in Los Angeles. McPherson was more than just a preacher. She was America's first celebrity evangelist, a woman who understood that in the age of mass media, salvation could be packaged and sold like any other entertainment product. Her radio broadcasts reached millions, her healing crusades filled football stadiums, and her personal life generated headlines that competed with Hollywood's biggest stars. But Sister Aimee's carefully constructed public image masked private struggles that would soon explode into the most sensational religious scandal of the decade. Behind the divine revelations and miraculous healings, McPherson was battling depression, financial pressures, and the exhausting demands of maintaining her spiritual empire. On May 18, 1926, McPherson told her staff she needed time to pray and prepare her upcoming sermons. She drove to Venice Beach, one of her favorite retreat locations, seeking the solitude necessary to commune with God away from the pressures of her ministry. It was a routine she had followed countless times before, but this time would be devastatingly different. When McPherson failed to return that evening, her staff became concerned but not alarmed. The evangelist was known for her spontaneous spiritual retreats. But as hours turned into days with no word from their leader, concern transformed into panic that would soon grip the entire nation. A massive search operation launched along the California coast, with volunteers combing beaches and diving teams searching offshore waters. McPherson's followers held around-the-clock prayer vigils, while newspapers across America carried front-page stories about the missing evangelist. The search became a media circus that combined genuine concern with sensationalized speculation about her fate. Then, after 5 weeks of silence, McPherson dramatically reappeared in the Mexican border town of Agua Prieta, claiming she had been kidnapped by a trio of criminals who had held her for ransom in a remote desert cabin. Her story was as theatrical as her sermons, complete with narrow escapes, divine intervention, and miraculous survival against impossible odds. But investigators immediately found problems with McPherson's kidnapping narrative. Her physical condition didn't match someone who had been held captive in harsh desert conditions, her clothes showed no signs of prolonged captivity, and key details of her story kept changing under questioning. Most damaging of all, witnesses placed her in various locations during her supposed captivity, suggesting she had been living comfortably rather than suffering in a kidnapper's hideout. The truth behind McPherson's disappearance became the subject of intense speculation that continues to this day. Some believed she had suffered a nervous breakdown and wandered into the desert in a dissociative state. Others suspected she had staged the entire kidnapping to generate publicity for her flagging ministry. The most scandalous theory suggested she had been conducting a secret affair and used the kidnapping story to cover up her absence. Los Angeles prosecutors eventually charged McPherson with conspiracy and perjury, claiming she had fabricated the kidnapping story and committed fraud against the taxpayers who had funded the massive search operation. The trial became a media sensation that exposed the dark underbelly of celebrity evangelism and the dangerous intersection of fame, faith, and human weakness. McPherson's disappearance and the scandal that followed marked a turning point in American religious culture, demonstrating how quickly divine authority could be undermined by very human failings, and the power of modern media to both create and destroy religious celebrities. Case 6. Joseph Kibweteere. Joseph Kibweteere presented himself as a former Catholic seminarian turned prophet, claiming direct communication with the Virgin Mary about humanity's approaching apocalypse. His movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God attracted thousands of Ugandans who believed they were joining the final faithful remnant before Christ's return to earth. Kibweteere's theology was a dangerous mixture of Catholic mysticism and doomsday prophecy. He taught that the world would end on December 31, 1999, and that only his followers would be saved through strict adherence to the original 10 Commandments. Members sold their possessions, abandoned their families, and moved to isolated compounds where they prepared for the end times through prayer, fasting, and absolute obedience to their prophets' divine revelations. The movement operated like a totalitarian state, disguised as a religious community. Kibweteere controlled every aspect of his followers' lives, from their daily schedules to their sexual relationships. Speaking was forbidden, except on designated days. Communication with the outside world was prohibited, and questioning the prophet's authority was considered a sin worthy of severe punishment. As the predicted end date approached, Kibweteere's followers sold everything they owned and gathered at the movement's headquarters in Kanungu, Uganda, preparing for their divine translation into heaven. But when December 31, 1999 passed without apocalypse, the prophet faced a crisis that threatened to destroy his authority and expose his fraud. Rather than admit his prophecy had failed, Kibweteere simply moved the end date forward, claiming God had revealed additional time for final preparations. But this postponement created dangerous tension within the movement, as disillusioned followers began demanding the return of their money and possessions, threatening to expose the movement's financial crimes to authorities. The pressure on Kibweteere became unbearable, as more followers questioned his divine authority and demanded accountability for his failed predictions. Former members were escaping the compounds and telling authorities about financial fraud, child abuse, and other crimes being committed under the guise of religious preparation. On March 17, 2000, Kibweteere announced that God had revealed the final date for their heavenly departure. He gathered hundreds of his most devoted followers in the movement's main church building for what he promised would be their last earthly service before joining Christ in paradise. But instead of divine translation, Kibweteere's followers experienced human horror. The church building erupted in flames that consumed everything inside, killing an estimated 530 people who had been locked inside with no means of escape. The fire burned so intensely that most victims were reduced to ash, making identification impossible and body counts uncertain. Initial reports suggested the tragedy was a mass suicide, with followers willingly burning themselves to death in anticipation of heavenly reward. But subsequent investigations revealed evidence of murder, including boarded windows, blocked exits, and the presence of accelerants that indicated the fire had been deliberately set by someone outside the building. Most shocking of all was the discovery that Joseph Kibweteere himself was nowhere to be found among the hundreds of charred corpses. The prophet who had promised to lead his followers into paradise had apparently escaped before the flames began, leaving his devoted believers to burn while he fled to safety. Ugandan authorities launched an international manhunt for Kibweteere, suspecting he had orchestrated the mass murder to eliminate witnesses to his crimes and escape with the movement's substantial financial assets. But despite years of investigation and cooperation from international law enforcement agencies, the missing prophet was never found. Whether Kibweteere died in hiding, assumed a new identity, or simply vanished into the chaos of Central Africa remains unknown. His disappearance represents one of the most disturbing examples of religious authority being used to commit mass murder while the perpetrator escapes justice completely. Case 7. Credonia Mwerinde. While Joseph Kibweteere may have been the public face of the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God, the true power behind the apocalyptic cult belonged to a former prostitute turned prophetess named Credonia Mwerinde. Her transformation from sex worker to religious leader represented one of the most dramatic redemption stories in Ugandan Christianity, until it became one of the most horrific examples of spiritual manipulation in modern history. Mwerinde claimed that the Virgin Mary had appeared to her in 1989, commanding her to establish a new religious movement that would prepare humanity for the approaching apocalypse. Her mystical experiences and charismatic personality attracted followers who believed they were witnessing genuine divine revelation through this unlikely prophet. What made Mwerinde particularly dangerous was her ability to combine maternal authority with supernatural claims. She presented herself as a spiritual mother figure who could provide both earthly guidance and heavenly protection to followers who surrendered completely to her authority. Her gender gave her unique access to women and families who might have been suspicious of male religious leaders. Mwerinde's prophetic visions were elaborate and specific, describing detailed conversations with the Virgin Mary about humanity's sins and the coming judgment. She claimed to receive regular divine communications that guided every aspect of the movement's operations, from financial decisions to membership requirements to preparations for the end times. The prophetess wielded absolute authority within the movement's hierarchy, often overruling even Kibweteere when their interpretations of divine will conflicted. Her followers viewed her as the primary channel of God's communication, making her arguably more powerful than the movement's nominal male leadership. But Mwerinde's mystical authority masked a calculating criminal mind that understood how to exploit religious devotion for personal gain. She systematically stripped followers of their possessions, separated families to increase dependency on the movement, and used claims of divine revelation to justify increasingly extreme demands for obedience and sacrifice. As the movement's predicted end date approached, and tensions mounted over failed prophecies, Mwerinde found herself facing the same crisis of credibility that threatened Kibweteere. Disillusioned followers were demanding answers and threatening to expose the movement's crimes to authorities who were already growing suspicious of the cult's activities. On the morning of March 17, 2000, Mwerinde was seen by multiple witnesses preparing for what she claimed would be the movement's final earthly gathering. She appeared calm and confident as she helped organize the service that would supposedly transport hundreds of followers directly to heaven through divine intervention. But when the church building erupted in flames that killed over 500 people, Credonia Mwerinde was nowhere to be found among the victims. Like Kibweteere, the prophetess had apparently escaped before the massacre began, abandoning her followers to burn while she fled to safety. The absence of both primary leaders from the mass death scene convinced investigators that the tragedy was premeditated murder rather than mass suicide. Mwerinde and Kibweteere had apparently planned the massacre as a way to eliminate witnesses to their crimes while escaping with the movement's substantial assets. International manhunts were launched for both missing leaders, but Mwerinde proved even more elusive than her male counterpart. Some investigators believe her gender and lower public profile made it easier for her to disappear into Uganda's rural communities without detection. Years have passed since that horrific March morning, yet Credonia Mwerinde remains among the world's most wanted fugitives. Her case demonstrates how religious authority can be weaponized by those who understand how to manipulate faith for criminal purposes, and how easily spiritual mothers can become architects of mass murder. Whether she died in hiding, assumed a new identity, or continues to operate under different religious personas remains unknown, making her one of the most dangerous missing persons in African criminal history. Case 8. Pastor Ikenna Nnadi. Pastor Ikenna Nnadi had dedicated his life to serving the impoverished communities of Delta State, Nigeria, where his Grace of God Mission Church provided hope and practical assistance to families struggling against poverty, unemployment, and the environmental devastation caused by decades of oil extraction in the Niger Delta region. Nnadi's ministry extended far beyond Sunday sermons. He operated feeding programs for malnourished children, provided educational scholarships for promising students, and served as a mediator in community disputes that might otherwise escalate into violence. His commitment to social justice had earned him respect across religious and ethnic lines in a region plagued by conflict and inequality. The pastor's work required constant travel throughout the Delta's maze of rivers, creeks, and waterways that connect scattered communities across the oil-rich but environmentally damaged landscape. He frequently used boats to reach remote villages where government services were non-existent and religious ministries were the only source of outside assistance. On February 4, 2021, Nnadi embarked on what should have been a routine pastoral visit to communities along the Forcados River. These journeys were essential to his ministry, but inherently dangerous due to the region's unstable waterways, unpredictable weather, and ongoing security threats from criminal gangs who controlled much of the Delta's water traffic. The pastor departed early that morning with a small crew, carrying supplies for the communities he planned to visit. His family expected him to return by evening, as he had done dozens of times before during years of river-based ministry work, but as night fell without any word from Nnadi, concern began mounting among his congregation and family members. Hours after his expected return, Nnadi's family received a text message that would transform their concern into devastating grief. The message, reportedly sent from the pastor's phone, contained just a few words: "I have drowned. The boat capsized." The cryptic nature of the message immediately raised suspicions among investigators and family members. How could someone who had just drowned send a text message? Who had access to his phone if he had indeed perished in the river? The timing and content of the message suggested either a hoax or something far more sinister than a simple drowning accident. Search and rescue operations launched immediately, with local authorities and volunteer teams scouring the treacherous waters where Nnadi was believed to have disappeared. The Niger Delta's complex network of waterways made the search extraordinarily difficult, with strong currents, dense vegetation, and murky water hampering efforts to locate either the pastor or his vessel. Days of intensive searching yielded no trace of Nnadi, his boat, or his traveling companions. The river seemed to have swallowed them completely, leaving behind only that mysterious text message and a growing list of unanswered questions about what had really happened during that final journey. Investigators began exploring alternative theories about Nnadi's disappearance. The Delta region was notorious for kidnappings, with criminal gangs regularly targeting prominent community leaders for ransom. Some suspected that pirates had attacked Nnadi's boat and were using the drowning story to cover up an abduction that had gone wrong. Others pointed to the pastor's social justice work as a possible motive for his disappearance. Nnadi had been vocal about environmental destruction and corporate exploitation in the Delta, positions that had earned him enemies among powerful interests who preferred religious leaders to focus on spiritual rather than political matters. The involvement of his phone in sending that final message suggested a level of premeditation that contradicted theories of accidental drowning. Someone had deliberately crafted a narrative to explain Nnadi's disappearance, while potentially covering up evidence of foul play. Years have passed since that February morning, yet Pastor Ikenna Nnadi remains missing without any definitive explanation of his fate. His case highlights the dangerous reality faced by religious leaders who dare to combine spiritual ministry with social activism in regions where powerful interests prefer silence over justice. Case 9. Esekere Okilo. Pastor Esekere Okilo had become a pillar of the Christian community in Basambiri, Bayelsa State, Nigeria, where his quiet dedication to ministry and genuine care for his congregation had earned him deep respect among believers and non-believers alike. Unlike the flashy televangelists who dominated Nigerian religious media, Okilo focused on practical Christianity that addressed the daily struggles of families living in one of Nigeria's most challenging environments. Bayelsa State, located in Nigeria's oil-rich Niger Delta, presented unique challenges for religious leaders. Environmental degradation from decades of petroleum extraction had poisoned waterways and destroyed traditional livelihoods, while youth restiveness and criminal activity created ongoing security threats that made ministry work increasingly dangerous. Okilo's church operated as both a spiritual center and community resource, providing marriage counseling, youth programs, and emergency assistance to families struggling with poverty and unemployment. His approach to ministry emphasized personal relationships over public spectacle, making him beloved by his congregation but relatively unknown beyond his immediate community. In early 2023, Pastor Okilo began experiencing what his family later described as unusual stress and anxiety. He spoke privately about feeling watched and expressed concerns about threats to his safety, though he never identified specific sources of danger or provided details about what was troubling him. On an ordinary morning in 2023, Okilo left his home for what he told his family would be routine church business. He provided no specific details about his destination or expected return time, treating the departure as just another day in his regular pastoral routine. His calm demeanor gave no indication that anything was wrong or that he sensed impending danger. But Pastor Okilo never returned home. His family's initial concern transformed into alarm as hours turned into days with no word from their beloved pastor. They contacted church members, searched local hospitals, and reached out to colleagues throughout the region, but no one had seen or heard from Okilo since his departure. The disappearance triggered a massive community search effort that included church members, local authorities, and volunteers from across Bayelsa State. Teams combed through markets, hospitals, morgues, and remote areas where Okilo might have traveled for ministry purposes, but their efforts yielded no clues about his whereabouts. Months passed without any breakthrough in the investigation. Okilo's family maintained hope that he might have suffered memory loss or been hospitalized somewhere without identification, but as time passed, these optimistic scenarios became increasingly unlikely. For 15 agonizing months, the pastor's fate remained a complete mystery that haunted his congregation and family. They held vigils, organized prayer meetings, and continued searching for any evidence that might explain his disappearance or provide closure to their grief. Then, in January 2025, investigators made a discovery that shocked the entire community and raised more questions than it answered. While conducting a thorough search of Okilo's own residence, a location that had been checked multiple times during the initial investigation, they found human skeletal remains hidden within the house. DNA testing confirmed the devastating truth. The remains belonged to Pastor Esekere Okilo himself. The discovery transformed a missing person case into a potential murder investigation that baffled authorities and terrified the local community. How had Okilo's body ended up in his own home? Who had hidden the remains there? And why? Had he been killed elsewhere and his body moved? Or had he died in his own house, under circumstances that someone desperately wanted to conceal? The condition of the skeletal remains made determining cause of death extremely difficult, while the location raised disturbing questions about who had access to Okilo's home and knowledge of the family's routines. The fact that multiple searches had failed to discover the remains suggested either expert concealment or that the body had been moved to the location after the initial investigations. Okilo's family struggled to process not only their loss but the horrifying realization that their loved one had been hidden in his own home while they spent over a year searching for him. The psychological trauma of this discovery added another layer of cruelty to an already devastating tragedy. Case 10. Father Jim Brown. Father Jim Brown arrived in Sri Lanka during one of the most violent periods in the island nation's modern history, when a brutal civil war between the government and Tamil Tigers had transformed the country into a battlefield where civilians, aid workers, and religious leaders became targets in an increasingly desperate conflict that showed no respect for neutrality or sacred calling. Brown's decision to serve in Sri Lanka represented the kind of missionary commitment that defined Catholic priests who chose the world's most dangerous assignments. While other clergy sought comfortable parishes in peaceful locations, Brown deliberately chose a posting where his faith would be tested daily by exposure to human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. The Sri Lankan Civil War had created a humanitarian crisis that devastated Tamil communities in the north and east of the country. Government forces and Tamil Tiger rebels engaged in tactics that deliberately targeted civilian populations, using displacement, disappearances, and mass killings as weapons of war against anyone suspected of supporting the opposing side. Catholic priests working in Tamil areas found themselves caught between competing military forces that viewed any assistance to civilian populations as potential support for their enemies. Providing food to hungry families could be interpreted as aiding rebels, while offering medical care to wounded civilians might be seen as treating enemy combatants. Father Brown understood these dangers but believed his religious calling transcended political considerations. He worked with Tamil communities that had been abandoned by government services and terrorized by both sides in the conflict, providing spiritual guidance and practical assistance to families struggling to survive in an environment where death could come at any moment. The priest's work put him in direct contact with some of Sri Lanka's most vulnerable populations: displaced families living in makeshift camps, widows whose husbands had been disappeared by security forces, and children orphaned by violence that seemed to have no end. His presence provided not just spiritual comfort, but tangible proof that the outside world had not forgotten their suffering. But this visibility also made Father Brown a target for forces that preferred to operate without witnesses. Both government security forces and Tamil Tiger operatives had reasons to eliminate foreign priests who might document human rights abuses or provide testimony about war crimes being committed against civilian populations. The systematic targeting of religious leaders had become a horrific feature of Sri Lanka's civil war. Priests, pastors, and Buddhist monks who served in conflict zones faced kidnapping, torture, and murder by armed groups that viewed their humanitarian work as obstacles to military objectives. The disappearance of clergy had become so common that international human rights organizations struggled to maintain accurate counts of missing religious workers. Father Brown's disappearance followed the same pattern that had claimed dozens of other religious leaders throughout the conflict. One day, he was conducting his normal pastoral duties among Tamil families who depended on his ministry for both spiritual and material support. The next day, he was gone without any explanation or trace. No ransom demands were made, no body was ever recovered, and no credible witnesses came forward with information about his fate. Like so many others who vanished during Sri Lanka's civil war, Father Brown simply disappeared into the void of state-censured violence and rebel brutality that consumed thousands of civilians whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. International Catholic organizations launched diplomatic campaigns to determine Brown's fate, but their efforts were hampered by the Sri Lankan government's refusal to cooperate with independent investigations and the Tamil Tigers' policy of denying involvement in attacks against religious workers. Rights groups documented Father Brown's case as part of a broader pattern of enforced disappearances that affected not just Catholic priests, but religious leaders from all communities who dared to serve populations caught in the crossfire of ethnic conflict and political violence. The war eventually ended, but Father Brown was never found among the survivors. His disappearance remains unresolved, a symbol of the price paid by religious leaders who choose to serve in the world's most dangerous places, where faith becomes both a beacon of hope and a target for those who profit from human suffering. 10 disappearances, 10 mysteries, 10 chilling reminders that spiritual authority provides no protection from the darkest forces of human nature and political violence. These disappearances have devastated not just individual families but entire communities that depended on these religious leaders for spiritual guidance, social services, and advocacy against injustice. The ripple effects extend far beyond the immediate victims to encompass thousands of followers left without shepherds and entire regions where religious freedom has been effectively eliminated through terror.